driver never saw her leave the taxi because she was already gone. Tokyo, just after midnight. The driver had been working in Tokyo for nearly 20 years. He was not a superstitious man. During his career, he had heard strange stories from other drivers. A passenger who could not be seen in the mirror. A woman who asked to be taken to a house demolished years earlier. A child who entered a taxi alone, but was never seen leaving it. The driver listened to these stories, but he never believed them. Long hours and lack of sleep, he thought, could make anyone imagine strange things. And on rainy nights, reflections on the windows could easily resemble faces. There was always a reasonable explanation. At least, that was what he believed. Until one night in late autumn, it was shortly after 12:30 in the morning. The rain had been falling since the evening, and the roads were almost empty. The driver was considering returning to the taxi office when he saw someone standing beside the road. It was a young woman. She wore a pale coat and had no umbrella. Her long hair was wet and hung across the sides of her face. She was not standing near a station, a shop, or an apartment entrance. There was nothing around her except a narrow road, a concrete wall, and a row of dark houses. The driver slowed down. The woman raised one hand, so he stopped. The rear door opened automatically. The woman entered without saying anything. The driver looked at her through the mirror. Her head was lowered. Water dripped from her hair and coat onto the seat. "Where would you like to go?" he asked. For several seconds, she did not answer. Then, in a quiet voice, she gave him an address. It was in a residential area on the western side of the city. The driver knew the district. It was not far away. He entered the address into the navigation system and began driving. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. The driver was used to silent passengers, but something about the woman made him uncomfortable. She sat perfectly still. She did not look at her phone. She did not look through the window. She did not even seem to move with the turns of the car. At a red light, the driver glanced at the mirror again. The woman was still looking down. He could see her hair. He could see the pale shoulders of her coat. But he could not clearly see her face. The light changed. The driver continued. A few minutes later, he tried to make conversation. "The rain is getting heavier," he said. There was no reply. He looked into the mirror. The woman slowly raised her head. For a moment, the driver thought she was looking directly at him. Then she said, "Yes." Only that one word. As they approached the address, the streets became narrower. apartment buildings and shops disappeared. Now there were only old houses, small gardens, and concrete walls darkened by the rain. The navigation system instructed the driver to turn left, but the road ahead looked too narrow for a taxi. He slowed down. "Is this the correct way?" he asked. The woman did not answer. The driver looked at the navigation screen. The destination was only 200 meters away. He continued carefully. Then, from the back seat, the woman spoke again. "Please stop in front of the next house." The driver looked ahead. At the end of the road stood an old 2-story house. All its windows were dark. The taxi stopped beside the gate. The driver checked the meter. Then he turned slightly toward the back seat. "We have arrived," he said. There was no response. He waited. The automatic door remained closed. Perhaps the woman had fallen asleep. The driver turned farther around. The back seat was empty. The driver stared at the seat. The woman was gone. Both rear doors were still locked. He had not heard either of them open. The windows were closed. There was no possible way for her to have left the taxi without him noticing. For several seconds, he could not move. Then he saw the water. The seat was wet where the woman had been sitting. There were drops of water on the floor, and on the window beside the empty seat was the faint impression of a hand. The driver unlocked the doors and stepped outside. The street was deserted. There was nowhere the woman could have gone. No open gate, no alleyway, no movement behind the curtains of the nearby houses, only the rain. The driver considered leaving immediately, but the address the woman had given him was the house directly in front of the taxi. He wanted an explanation, so he walked to the entrance and pressed the doorbell. At first, nothing happened. He pressed it again. A light appeared behind one of the windows. After a short wait, an elderly man opened the door. The driver apologized for disturbing him. Then he explained that he had brought a young woman to the address. He described her pale coat, her long dark hair, and the place where he had picked her up. The old man said nothing. His expression changed. He asked the driver to wait. Then he disappeared into the house. A minute later, he returned holding a framed photograph. It showed a young woman wearing a pale coat. The driver recognized her immediately. It was the passenger from the taxi. The old man told him that the woman in the photograph was his daughter. Several years earlier, she had died in a traffic accident. The place where the driver had picked her up was close to the road where the accident had happened. The old man then looked toward the taxi. "This is not the first time," he said. Other drivers had come to the house late at night. They had brought the same passenger. She always wore the same pale coat. She always gave the same address. and she always disappeared before the driver could open the door. The driver returned to his taxi. The rear seat was still wet. He wiped it several times, but the mark left by the woman's body would not completely disappear. That night, he drove back to the taxi office without accepting another passenger. He never saw the woman again. But after that night, whenever he drove past the place where she had been waiting, he avoided looking toward the side of the road. Because sometimes, just beyond the reach of the headlights, he thought he could see someone standing in the rain. Stories of ghost passengers have been told in many countries. But in Japan, taxi ghost stories have developed into a distinct form of modern folklore. The details change from one telling to another. Sometimes the passenger is a woman returning to her family home. Sometimes it is a child asking to be taken to a school. In other versions, the passenger disappears near the site of an accident or disaster. These stories are often presented as accounts passed between drivers. Whether they began as real experiences, misunderstandings, or simple ghost stories is impossible to know. The story you have just heard is a fictional retelling inspired by this tradition. But the next time you see a taxi stop on an empty road late at night, look carefully at the back seat. The driver may not be alone.